Everyone knows the Vikings as fearless explorers and raiders of legend, warriors who pushed farther across the Atlantic than medieval Europe. They reached Iceland, then Greenland, pressing deeper into the unknown. They even reached North America 500 years before Columbus. To most people, this sounds like an undeniable success story. Expansion, discovery, and triumph against impossible odds. But the Viking settlement of Greenland did not end in triumph. It ended quietly, without battle, conquest, or witnesses. By the early 1400s, the Norse colonies vanished completely. Farms were abandoned, churches stood empty, ships stopped arriving. There was no final war, no dramatic collapse, no last stand, just a slow disappearance at the edge of the known world. This was not a mystery collapse driven by myth or speculation. It was not caused by one cold winter or a sudden invasion. The Norse did not fail because they were weak or unlucky. They failed because their economic system stopped working. And once trade collapsed, everything else followed behind it. This is a story about fragile systems and how they truly break, especially when survival depends on a single trade network. It shows how confidence, not violence, determines survival, and why Greenland fell not to climate alone, but to economics. To understand what went wrong, we need to rewind to the beginning. In 985 AD, Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland. He was not lying exactly, but he was selling optimism. He named the land Greenland to make it sound fertile and inviting, and for a time, that optimism appeared to be justified. The Norse built two major settlements on the southwest coast, known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. At their peak, 4,000 to 5,000 people lived there. They built farms and raised cattle, sheep, and goats to survive. They constructed stone churches modelled on those back in Norway. On the surface, this looked like a stable medieval society. Beneath that surface, it was dangerously dependent on trade. Greenland produced almost nothing Europe actually needed. Timber was scarce, grain barely grew, iron had to be imported. Even basic tools arrived only by ship from Iceland or Norway. Greenland could not survive as a closed or independent system. Its survival depended entirely on trade connections, and trade meant ships crossing the North Atlantic every year. Only a small number of vessels made the journey annually. They carried supplies to Greenland and returned with one thing, something extremely valuable in medieval Europe at the time: walrus ivory. This is the key detail most people completely miss. Walrus ivory was the backbone of Greenland's economy. In medieval Europe, ivory was not just decoration or art. It was strategic material used by churches and elites. Religious objects, chess pieces, jewelry, knife handles, luxury goods demanded by kings, bishops, and nobles. Elephant ivory was scarce and unreliable in this period. Walrus ivory filled a critical gap in European markets. Greenland had some of the richest walrus grounds in the Atlantic. Norse hunters travelled far north into dangerous Arctic waters. Every expedition carried a real and constant risk of death. Tusks were shipped back to Europe and exchanged for survival. Food security, tools, iron, timber, and status goods. This trade was not optional or supplemental to life. It was existential to Greenland's continued survival. As long as ivory flowed, Greenland survived. As long as demand stayed strong, ships kept coming. When that demand weakened, Greenland had no backup system. Slowly and quietly, the trade network began to break down. By the 1200s, European markets were already changing. Elephant ivory from Africa reached Europe in larger volumes. It was cheaper, easier to carve, and safer to obtain. At the same time, fashion and elite status symbols shifted. Luxury ivory objects lost their cultural importance. Chess pieces and religious carvings mattered far less. Greenland's single export steadily lost value. This was the first crack in the entire system. But the collapse did not happen overnight. For decades, Greenland struggled but continued. Fewer ships arrived and supplies became unreliable. Still, the Norse believed conditions would normalize. This is where climate enters the story, but not as the cause. In the 1400s, the Little Ice Age took hold. Temperatures dropped, sea ice expanded, storms intensified. Sailing routes became more dangerous and unpredictable. Greenland did not instantly become uninhabitable. The Norse had survived harsh winters before. What changed was the cost and risk of trade. Fewer ships attempted the crossing each year. Losses increased and prices rose across the system. The lifeline weakened even further. At the same time, the Norse refused to adapt their lifestyle. They lived alongside the Inuit, known as the Thule people. The Inuit thrived in Arctic conditions year-round. They hunted seals, whales, and fish efficiently. They used kayaks and tailored fur clothing. The Norse saw this clearly and largely ignored it. They continued raising cattle as grazing land shrank. They built churches instead of more boats. European identity mattered more than survival. Elites imported luxury goods even as food declined. This was not ignorance or stupidity, it was ideology. To the Norse, being European meant farming and hierarchy. Adopting Inuit practices meant abandoning identity, and so they chose not to adapt. As trade collapsed, social stability followed behind it. Iron tools became scarce and farming grew harder. Hunting expeditions became desperate and dangerous. Church authority weakened as ties to Norway faded. Marriage networks collapsed and young people left. The Western settlement disappeared first in the mid-1300s. No massacre, no fire, no signs of violence, just abandonment. The Eastern settlement lasted longer than the rest. A wedding was recorded there in 1408. After that, there is only silence. No letters, no trade records, no ships arriving. When Europeans returned generations later, farms were empty, the Norse were gone. Here is the critical lesson of Greenland. The Vikings did not collapse from weakness or fear. They collapsed from economic dependency. One fragile trade flow controlled everything. When export value fell, the system failed. When shipping costs rose, adjustment became impossible. When confidence broke, collapse followed naturally. They had no currency to debase, no empire to tax, no army to defend borders. But the logic remains exactly the same. When trade stops, specialization becomes a liability. When confidence breaks, complexity collapses. When survival depends on imports, trust decides fate. The Norse believed ships would always come. They believed Europe would always need ivory. They believed identity mattered more than adaptation. They were wrong. The most unsettling part is how quiet the collapse was. No disaster year, no final decision to leave. Just fewer ships, fewer tools, fewer calories, fewer people. Collapse by subtraction. This is how systems actually fail. We imagine collapse as dramatic and sudden, crashes, blackouts, riots, and chaos. History shows something very different. Societies fade through disconnection. Trade routes shift, demand changes, costs rise. Confidence erodes without warning. Systems built for efficiency lose resilience. The Norse were not foolish or ignorant. They were rational inside a system that once worked. Systems do not warn you when they stop working. They simply stop. This story is not just about Vikings. It is about dependency itself, about fragile logistics and distant markets, about assuming tomorrow looks like yesterday. When trade collapses, ideology does not save you. Tradition does not save you. Identity does not save you. Only adaptability does. The Vikings conquered oceans, but they could not conquer arithmetic. Greenland remains a warning carved into history. Even legendary societies can vanish quietly when the trade they depend on disappears.